The pain came like a knife twisting under my ribs, sudden and merciless. I remember clutching the edge of my kitchen counter, the taste of iron filling my mouth before the world spun away. The next thing I saw was the blur of fluorescent lights rushing overhead as paramedics wheeled me through the emergency doors. Massive internal bleeding. One of them muttered. My ears rang. But I caught the words. My chest rose and fell in shallow bursts. I was 71. But in that moment, I felt older than the century. In the trauma room, a doctor leaned close, voice urgent yet steady. "Mrs. Vale, your blood pressure is dangerously low. You need an immediate transfusion. Your type is O negative. We've sent word to your family." I closed my eyes, clinging to the thought that Celine would come. My daughter, brilliant lawyer, the one I sacrificed everything for. She had my same rare blood. Surely she would not let me go like this. When the doors opened and Celine's heels clicked across the linoleum, I almost wept with relief, but the relief lasted only seconds. She looked down at me with a smile that did not belong on a daughter's face. "I'd rather die than save a failure like you," she said, each word sharp as glass. The room went silent. I felt colder than the IV running into my veins. The doctor stammered, trying to appeal to her sense of duty. But Celine leaned closer to him, her voice a whisper. She must have thought I couldn't hear. Let her go. Her death will make everything easier. My hand trembled as I pressed the side of my sweater. Inside the pocket, the slim silver barrel of a pen recorder glowed like a secret weapon. Every word was being captured. Even as my vision blurred, I forced myself to breathe, shallow but steady. If my own child had turned predator, then survival meant more than blood. It meant memory. It meant evidence. And it meant remembering everything I had once given her, and everything she was about to throw away. As the beeping of machines filled the hospital room, my mind drifted backward, away from the sting of Celine's words and into the years that had shaped her. I remembered the winter when my husband, Daniel, passed suddenly, leaving me with a 7-year-old daughter and debts that dwarfed my salary as a schoolteacher. I took on night shifts at a diner, my hands smelling of grease and coffee grounds, while by day I drilled multiplication tables into restless children. My bones ached, but I carried the weight because she was my reason. There was the piano I once loved, the one Daniel saved up to buy me on our 5th anniversary. I sold it to cover Celine's entrance fees to her prep school. The man who hauled it away looked at me strangely, as if he knew I was giving away the last piece of my joy. I told myself her future was worth more than my music. When the acceptance letter to Harvard Law arrived, I wept into the same apron I wore to mop diner floors. I bought her a leather briefcase, brand new, while I stitched my own coats at the seam to hide the thinning fabric. Each graduation photo on the wall of my little Ohio house showed her draped in robes of success, while behind the camera, I wore dresses rescued from thrift shops. For years, I believed sacrifice was the silent contract of motherhood, to give until nothing remained, so that your child might shine brighter. I gave Celine everything, my time, my money, my health, even the echo of music in my home. And in return, she gave me disdain, sharpened into words that cut deeper than any wound in my body. The doctor's footsteps approached again, pulling me back to the present. My strength was failing, but I knew weakness was no longer an option. If Celine wanted to erase me, she would soon discover that I had learned how to endure far crueler storms. The hum of the machines became my lullaby, but I refused to close my eyes completely. I let my lids droop just enough to make it seem I was drifting in and out. To anyone watching, I looked like a frail woman barely holding on. That illusion became my armor. Celine entered the room with Corin at her side. His lab coat hung loosely from his shoulders, the insignia of a respected surgeon. Though I knew titles could not disguise the shadows under his eyes, they believed the sedatives had dulled my mind. I slowed my breathing, let my hand twitch against the blanket, and waited. "She's weaker than they thought," Celine murmured, her tone more clinical than caring. "If we move quickly, we can have her placed in Fairview Residence before she regains too much strength." Corin's voice was low but steady. "And once she's in there, the evaluation will prove what we need. I've already spoken with a colleague willing to sign the report. Early signs of dementia, lack of capacity to handle finances. It won't take much. She'll be declared incompetent." The words washed over me like acid. I had spent decades protecting my daughter from a world that showed no mercy, and here she was plotting to strip me of the little dignity I had left. What about the properties she pressed? The house, the rentals, the savings. I checked she never moved the deeds into a trust. Everything can transfer directly once she's declared unfit. Corin nodded, as if they were discussing numbers on a ledger instead of the life of the woman lying inches away. Inside my pocket, the pen recorder captured each syllable. Its tiny red light blinked against the fabric of my gown. Every whisper, every conspiracy they were giving me the rope I would later use to bind them. I kept still. Even when rage clawed at my chest, their greed was now spoken into permanence. What they thought was a secret had already become my weapon. The next morning, I resolved to gather more than whispers. I needed proof no one could dismiss. The hospital night carried its own rhythm machines humming, heels clicking faintly down the corridors. Voices hushed as though grief might be contagious. I lay still, eyes closed, listening. Celine and Corin slipped into the hallway just beyond my door, their silhouettes breaking the sterile light. They thought I was asleep, too fragile to follow the thread of their words. "I can't keep covering the losses forever," Corin whispered, his voice a blade drawn thin. 3 lawsuits are already in motion. If another surfaces, the board will suspend me. "You should have been more careful," Celine hissed back. "Unnecessary surgeries, charging families who could barely pay. Now everything we've built looks like a sham." Corin's shoes scraped against the linoleum as he shifted. "I did it for us. The house, the cars, the image we couldn't maintain it otherwise. Do you want to go back to that cramped apartment, living paycheck to paycheck? You think I'll let that happen?" Her tone was acid. "My mother has over $500,000 tied up in property alone. Once she's declared incompetent, we can funnel the income, the rentals, the savings, everything." A pause stretched between them, thick with greed and fear, and Iris Corin asked finally, "She's a child," Celine said coldly. "She'll adjust. We'll send her to boarding school out of state, out of sight, out of mind." I kept my breathing shallow, every muscle frozen though my heart hammered. Each sentence carved a wound deeper than the last, yet clarity formed like glass around me. They weren't just careless children chasing comfort. They were predators cloaked in respectability, willing to discard me and use Iris as currency. I pressed my fingers gently against the pen in my pocket, comforted by the silent blink of its light. The words I was memorizing, the venom I was recording, would become the undoing of their carefully curated lives. When their footsteps faded down the hall, I opened my eyes to the ceiling's glare. Their whispers were no longer secrets. They were confessions, and I intended to use everyone the day I left the hospital. The air felt heavier, as if the world itself pressed down, daring me to collapse again. I refused. I walked slowly into my house, where the curtains were still drawn exactly as I had left them, and reached for a number I hadn't dialed in nearly 20 years. Marcellus Crowe, came the gravelly voice on the other end. Once a detective, now a private investigator. He was the kind of man who remembered debts both paid and unpaid. I told him I needed help, quiet help, and within an hour, he was sitting in my living room, his notepad open, his eyes sharp. I laid out the betrayal in clipped sentences, Celine's refusal, Corin's whisper, their plans for my properties. He listened without interruption, his pen scratching like a saw. "I'll dig," he said finally. "If there's rot, we'll find how deep it goes." 3 days later, Crow returned with a folder so thick it might have been a book of sins. He spread the papers across my table: lawsuits, depositions, unpaid debts. Corin had been accused of performing unnecessary surgeries on elderly patients, padding bills with phantom procedures. The malpractice suits totaled nearly $500,000. Celine's hands were no cleaner. Crow traced funds missing from 2 of her clients' trusts. Quiet investigations by the Bar Association. Whispers that she was one step from disbarment. Together, their empire was nothing more than glass-painted gold one crack, and it would shatter. But the page that made my chest tighten was the one with my own name. "Did you know," Crow said, tapping the file, "that Corin performed your gallbladder surgery back in '94. The records show complications nearly cost you your life." I remembered the pain, the endless recovery, how Celine had insisted Corin was the best. I had trusted him then, trusted both of them. Now I saw the symmetry for what it was, betrayal that had begun years ago, repeating itself like an old curse. I closed the folder slowly, the weight of it pressing into my hands. If they had gambled with my life once, they would not hesitate to do it again. The folder from Marcellus stayed on my table like a shadow that would not move. Every page told me what I already knew in my bones. Celine and Corin's hunger would not stop until I had nothing left. I needed more than evidence. I needed a snare they would walk into willingly. That is why I found myself in the office of Thaddeus Pike, the lawyer who had managed my affairs since Daniel's death. His office smelled of old paper and pipe tobacco, lit dimly by a green-shaded lamp that threw long shadows across the mahogany desk. I placed the folder before him. He read in silence, pausing only to raise his eyebrows at the more damning details. At last, he leaned back, fingers steepled. "Mrs. Vale," he said quietly, "we don't confront wolves head-on. We bait them." The plan grew between us like vines on brick. I would summon Celine and Corin under the pretense of an urgent will revision. I would play the part of a confused, frightened old woman, eager to put my affairs in order before the end. They would not be able to resist pushing me, pressing me, showing exactly who they were. Meanwhile, Pike would have a notary present, disguised as an assistant. My living room would be rigged with cameras, some hidden in picture frames, others behind the clock that once belonged to my mother. Every word would be documented, every false smile immortalized. When Pike slid the draft documents across his desk, the embossed seals glinting faintly, I felt a strange calm settle over me. For the first time since Celine's cold refusal at the hospital, I no longer felt powerless. By the time I walked out into the dusk, the trap was set. All that remained was to wait for them to step into it, as greed always ensures they will. They arrived exactly on time, dressed for victory. Celine's heels clicked against the hardwood, her perfume filling the air before she even spoke. Corin followed, carrying a leather folder as though he were about to conduct surgery on my life itself. I sat slouched on the sofa, wrapped in a faded cardigan, my hair left untamed on purpose. "Celine," I asked softly, tilting my head. Or was it Clara? I forget these days. Her eyes gleamed, not with concern, but with triumph. "Mother," she said slowly, enunciating each syllable. You wanted to talk about your will? Yes. Yes, I murmured, fumbling with the papers Pike had prepared. I can't remember where the deeds are. So many houses. Or was it only one? Corin leaned forward, voice gentle, rehearsed. It's all right. Mrs. Cavale. That's why it's important to give Celine power of attorney. She can manage everything for you. They thought they were winning. Celine exchanged a look with him, one corner of her mouth curling upward. It's for the best, she added. You're not stable anymore. I let my hand shake, allowed my gaze to wander. Perhaps you're right, I whispered. Perhaps I've lost too much already. Then, without warning, Celine's voice hardened. You always loved Iris more than me. Every gift, every hug, every word you gave her what you never gave me. The bitterness in her tone cut deeper than her cruelty at the hospital. For a moment, my mask almost slipped, but I kept my breathing slow, my expression hazy. Let her believe she had broken me. I raised my hand ever so slightly, brushing the edge of the side table where a framed photograph of Daniel once stood. The signal was subtle, but enough. Behind the glass, the tiny lens blinked awake. Other cameras had been recording from the moment they walked in, but this gesture marked the final confirmation. Celine and Corin continued pressing, unaware that every word, every sneer, every poisonous truth was already sealed in evidence. The knock on the door was gentle, almost courteous, but it split the room like thunder. Celine straightened, her face stiffening as Thaddeus Pike stepped inside with a notary in tow. He carried his briefcase with the ease of a man who knew the ground he stood on. Mrs. Vale, he said, inclining his head toward me before glancing at Celine and Corin. Shall we begin? Corin shifted uneasily, fingers tightening around his folder. Before he could speak, the front door opened again, and two uniformed officers entered, followed by a woman in a navy suit whose badge gleamed beneath the light. Celine's composure cracked. What is this? She demanded, her voice rising. The prosecutor spoke calmly. A formal inquiry. We've been provided with evidence of fraud, forgery, and elder abuse. We're here to secure additional statements. Corin bolted toward the coffee table, yanking at my framed photograph. He fumbled with the hidden device, desperate to erase what he had already given away. But as he pressed, the screen on the notary's laptop lit up, streaming the recording live. His frantic hands only amplified his guilt. Celine turned to me then, eyes wide, face drained of color. Mother, please, you don't understand. We were trying to help you. This is all a mistake. Stop this. I'm your daughter. I let her words hang in the stale air. My chest rose slowly as I leaned toward her, voice barely above a whisper. Mercy belongs to those who showed it first. Her mouth opened, then closed, her lips trembling around words that would never save her. The officers moved forward, guiding Celine and Corin toward the door, their protests dissolving into noise. I watched them go, the silence they left behind heavier than any chain. For the first time in months, I drew a full breath, steady and sure. The battle for my life was not over, but for now, justice had stepped through my door. The news spread faster than I could brace for it. Headlines screamed my daughter's shame, and Iris's young face appeared in photographs she had never agreed to. 17 was too tender an age to watch your parents led away in handcuffs. When she arrived at my farmhouse in Missouri, her suitcase looked heavier than her body. She stood in the doorway, cheeks flushed from the bus ride, eyes swollen from tears she had tried to hide. For a moment, I feared she would turn and run, unable to face the silence her parents had left behind. But then she stepped forward. "Grandma," she whispered, voice breaking, "you're the only one who ever made me feel safe." I pulled her into my arms, the suitcase thudding forgotten against the floorboards. Her shoulders shook as she cried, and I felt the weight of years settle and lift in the same breath. All I had lost in Celine seemed, in some small measure, returned through the fragile trust of her daughter. We spent the evening unpacking in the small bedroom that overlooked the cornfields. Iris placed her books on the shelf, her sketch pad on the desk, arranging little pieces of herself into my home. At supper, she barely ate, but when I passed her the bread, her hand lingered on mine longer than it needed to. Later, as the crickets sang outside, I watched her curl beneath the quilt I had stitched years ago, back when Celine was still a girl with laughter in her eyes. The circle of time closed strangely. Then mother to daughter, daughter to granddaughter. I knew healing would not be quick. But it had already begun. The roses had survived the winter better than I expected. By spring, their stems reached for the sun with a stubbornness I recognized in myself. I worked the soil with slow, steady hands, while Iris knelt beside me, her hair tied back, a smudge of dirt across her cheek. Months had passed since the trial. Celine and Corin had stood before the judge, their lies stripped bare, their reputations dismantled. The verdict was clear fraud, malpractice, conspiracy. The headlines no longer shocked me. They were simply the echo of what I had already known in my bones. What lingered was not the noise of their downfall, but the quiet of my own house. The silence that used to feel like absence now carried a different weight piece. Iris brought the watering can, tipping it carefully over the roots. "They look stronger this year," she said softly. "So do we," I answered. She smiled, the kind of smile that belonged to her and not to the shadows of her parents. She had settled into the farmhouse as if it had been waiting for her all along. Her drawings taped to the walls, her laughter filling the kitchen, her voice reading aloud to me in the evenings. I thought often of Celine, of the little girl I once carried on my shoulders, the girl who had grown into a woman I no longer recognized. Losing her felt like losing a limb, painful, but survivable. What remained was the clarity that sacrifice without respect becomes chains, and love without truth corrodes into cruelty. I pressed the soil around the roses, breathing in their faint perfume. Beside me, Iris slipped her arm through mine. In her presence, I found not replacement, but renewal, a different kind of inheritance. "Family," I whispered, "is not who shares your blood, it's who would give theirs to save you."